My name is William Thomas Mason, Jr. I was born in Norfolk, Virginia on July 27, 1926. My parents were William T. Mason, Sr., and my mother was Vivian Carter Mason. My father was born in Trinidad, in Barbados, in the West Indies, and he was an immigrant to this country. My mother was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and was raised in a little town about 30 miles west of Syracuse called Auburn, New York, and she was one of 7 children. My father's family, he had about 7 or 8 siblings. I think he had 1 brother and 5 or 6 sisters. In any event, he immigrated to this country around about, I guess it would have been about 1916. And like many immigrants, he came seeking a better life. He had some relatives in New York. One of his cousins was a physician in New York, and there were other relatives that had come, and others that came after he got here. For instance, once he was here and got established, he brought his parents over and bought them a house in New York, a brownstone. And in any event, that's how he got to this country.
Let me ask you, how old was he when he came, and what were his parents' names?
Well, he was born in 1897, and I believe he came over around about either 1915 or 1916. It was, I think the war had begun, but I don't know that the United States was in it at that point. And what was the other question?
Did he go through Ellis Island?
Oh yeah, well, he was an immigrant. You know, he was a legal immigrant. He had to come the way other legally immigrants came, yes.
Did his parents have money in Trinidad?
Well, I'm sure they had enough to take care of their 7 or 8 kids, but his father was a butcher and had a small store. And of course his mother was a parent, because they had 7 or 8 kids, and her job was being a homemaker.
So what did your father do when he arrived in New York?
That's, my father? Oh, well, he went out and got a job. I mean, you had to work. And he arrived at a time when he could get a job during the summer, or just before the summer began. They used to have these boats that ran from New York up to Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. I believe it was called the Fall River Line. These boats were large enough, not only did they carry passengers, but they were large enough to carry people and their vehicles. And they had cabins, because it was like an overnight trip. And many of them employed blacks, and a lot of these blacks were students. And these students went to various schools, and that's how he learned about Virginia Union University and others, Howard and so forth. And that's what led him to apply to go to Virginia Union, which is in Richmond.
And so he was there between what years?
When you say there?
At Virginia Union.
Oh, well, I believe he was there between, say, about 1916 and 1920, and in that general time frame. And when he finished Virginia Union, he went to Chicago, to where he enrolled in the University of Chicago. And it was there he met my mother. She was a student at the University of Chicago at that time. And I think she graduated about 1920, so he may have gotten there at 1919. I'm not absolutely certain about the dates.
What kinds of courses did he take? And what I mean is, what was he majoring in?
My belief is he was majoring in business. And I know my mother majored in social work, and that's what she got her degree in, about 1920. And my father majored in business. And when he finished, he came south. Actually, he went to Durham, where he got a job with a black insurance company called North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. And he began learning the life insurance business. And my mother went to New York, where she was employed by the YWCA in Brooklyn, as a matter of fact. And that's where she began her activities as a social worker.
So when did they decide to get married?
Well, I don't know when they decided, but they got married in 1925. And they married, I believe, in Brooklyn, or certainly in New York.
So they obviously kept in contact with each other.
Oh, yes. And then what happened is my father went to North Carolina Mutual, stayed there for a couple of years, learned about life insurance, learned about casualty insurance. North Carolina Mutual owned a small fire insurance company, and it was called, I'm trying to think of, oh dear, I can't think, Bankers Life? No, that's not right. It's not Life. Bankers, Casualty. Any event, they owned this small casualty insurance company which insured residences and that sort of thing, and he learned that business. He then came to Norfolk, and he opened up an insurance agency, and a real estate agency, got his license, and opened up an office selling casualty insurance. And I think it was Bankers Fire Insurance Company was the name. And North Carolina Mutual, I believe, had a small office here selling life insurance, so he didn't sell that. He just sold the casualty insurance. He was what is known as an independent agent. And he made contact with some 2 or 3 general agents so he could become a sub-agent, particularly specializing in casualty insurance. And none of the big white-owned insurance companies, certainly not in the South, would engage a black agent as a general agent. They would let general agents hire sub-agents, but they wouldn't hire any blacks as general agents. In any event, that's how he got started in business.
Did he ever talk about how the white insurance companies charged higher rates to blacks?
Well, he didn't talk about it to me, but I assume he discussed it with other agents. Number one, it was very difficult for blacks to even get into the insurance business. None of the major white companies were employing black agents, certainly not in the South. They may have been doing so in Boston or Chicago or New York, but even there it was not much. And this whole problem of rate and charge differential was, I'm sure, known to those in the business, but there was very little you could do about it. And for instance, discrimination in the whole area of housing and came to a head during the late 1940s, after the end of World War II. There was this tremendous built-up need for housing. You had all these veterans coming back from the military. You had others who had been working, especially in defense industries, and housing was in short supply. And one of the things that the federal government did to assist in meeting this demand was to create 2 agencies which would insure the mortgage loans. This made the people with the mortgage money, whether they were insurance companies, whether they were banks or other lending institutions, made them more willing to make loans here to somebody with a 1% down payment, no credit history, and to sell these people these homes and give them an opportunity to buy these homes with very low interest rates, 4%, because these loans were guaranteed by FHA or by the Veterans Administration. And in order for the homes to be guaranteed, they had to meet certain qualifications. And so that was a big boon to the whole housing industry. But these lenders would not lend to blacks. It was the only way a black person could get a home mortgage back there in those days. He had to get it from either a black-owned insurance company or a black bank. And they only had limited amount of funds available. And so they couldn't even really begin to meet the need. So blacks, not only in the mortgage business, but blacks in the real estate business, started pressuring the federal government. And they finally got, and I don't know under whose administration, whether it was Truman, it may have been President Truman, I'm not sure, but they finally got the administration to direct that FHA and VA, these government insuring organizations, would say to lenders, whether they were banks, insurance companies, whoever they were, unless you agree to sell to minorities, we, the government insuring agent, are not going to insure any more of the loans that you present and offer for FHA or VA insuring. It's amazing how suddenly these lending institutions decided they could make loans to minorities, because before that, they wouldn't let you in the door. Your money was not any good. And I can recall some very specific instances in our area that illustrate that point.
Give me some examples.
Well, one that comes readily to mind is a very fine development by blacks out in what was then Princess Anne County. It's now called the City of Virginia Beach. This development was known as L&J Gardens. The land was owned by a black funeral director, Walter Riddick. He had, I don't know, a couple of hundred acres. There was a black general contractor headquartered in Portsmouth who was a graduate of then Hampton Institute, and he had taken over his father's construction business. And so he... And
what was his name?
Deloach. I think it's Herlin, H-E-R-L-O-N, something like that. Herlin Deloach. And Deloach and Riddick got together. Riddick put up the land, and Deloach constructed the houses. And they were able to get construction money from one of the larger local banks. But when it came to permanent financing, couldn't get a dime. Went to every building and loan, went to all of the banks, even the bank that had lent them the construction money wouldn't lend them a dime on their permanent financing. So here they are constructing their first 10 houses. Now, these first 10, they weren't on spec. They had gotten 10 qualified buyers. So these people, they had pre-qualified them in terms of their income and credit and all that kind of stuff. But they couldn't get a dollar of permanent financing, so they couldn't close the loans. They came to my father. My father said, well, I'm going to try to help you. I can't guarantee it. But he knew people down at North Carolina Mutual, and he contacted them, North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance, explained the situation. They said, well, we understand the problem. It's all over the country. But we do a lot of business in Virginia. We'll help you. but we're not going to be able to take care of 200 houses. We'll sort of get the ball rolling. We'll take your first 10. And that'll show these other mortgage companies that this is a good risk, and so forth. So they took the first 10 permanent loans. That enabled Deloach and Riddick to complete the transactions, close the loans, get the people into the houses. So then they went on to the next 10. So of course now they're looking again for this permanent. They can get the construction money, but not the permanent money. Went through the same rigmarole, and these local companies wouldn't lend them a dime. They went to national companies that had local offices like New York Life and other big insurance companies that did those kind of loans, couldn't get a dime for blacks. So my father went back to North Carolina Mutual and said, well, we understand it's tough all over. Everywhere we do business, we have the same problem, or our customers have the same problem. We'll take your next 10. But listen, you've got to do something about this problem. They said, we've got to help us do something about it. In any event, they took the next 10. And by this time, there was a lot of pressure being put on the federal government to force the FHA and VA to, in effect, require these other lenders to stop discriminating against blacks. And that came along, and when that happened, then these other mortgage lenders opened up, and Deloach and Riddick were able to find companies who would lend them money on the permanent financing, so they were able to go ahead and finish the development. And that was it still is a lovely residential area.
Were any local black attorneys involved in this effort to try to change the policies or the practices of these lending agencies?
Well, I feel reasonably certain, and attorney Victor Ash, who was actually, I think he passed the bar about 41, and the war came along, so he didn't really open up his office because he had to go into the military service until after the war was over. And he came back and opened up an office about 46. And then there were other attorneys, black attorneys, who were already here. Some of them, one of them, for instance, J. Eugene Diggs. He finished law school about 1904, and he opened up an office about 1905 and had been practicing here all that time. His specialty was criminal defense work, and he was very good at it. And so I don't believe he got into mortgage or real estate transactions, but there was a lady lawyer in his office, and actually she had been his secretary, and he encouraged her to read law, and which she did, took and passed the bar exam, and was admitted to practice in 1926. She was the second black woman admitted in Virginia, and her name was Bertha L. Douglas, and she, if anybody in that office dealt in real estate, it would have been Bertha Douglas, because I don't think Lawyer Diggs, that wasn't his area of practice. And then around about 1948, Lawyer Diggs, he had a niece. His niece was T. Ione Diggs. And she had gone to Howard Law School and graduated, and she came back and passed the bar and joined Bertha Douglas about 48 or 49. They formed the firm. It was called Douglas and Diggs. But she was more of a trial attorney. She was a great criminal defense lawyer, and she had been out of college about 15 years when she went to law school. She'd done other things. She'd been a social worker, a teacher, and so forth when she decided she'd go to law school. And there were some other lawyers in town, but who may have been involved, I'm sure they were, in real estate transactions, but in terms of their influencing the activities of any of these major lenders, I don't know. I'm sure they attempted to, but a single person would be very ineffective. You need either an organization, or you need to be taking somebody to court, and that kind of stuff, and none of that was going on around here that I'm aware of.
Let me back up for a moment and ask you one more specific question about your father's activities. I remember reading an article in the Journal and Guide in the 1920s, and it talked about how your home, specifically your parents' home, was inundated with very angry white residents from the Bramilton neighborhood because they believed that your father was busy selling home sites to blacks in that area because he was involved with real estate transactions. And I was wondering if you remembered him talking at all about that, or remember that incident.
No, at the time, our home, when I was born and when my parents got married, the address was 909 Maypole Avenue, which was in the so-called Boulevard Terrace area, which Maypole was a north-south street about 3 or 4 blocks east of Park Avenue. And it went from Corprew north up to Princess Anne Road. And in any event, that whole Boulevard Terrace area, there were very, very, very few houses out there. The house that my parents had, my father bought it. It was partially completed, and he completed it in preparation for he's going to get married. And there was one other house in that block, and that was owned by a black dentist. Actually, it faced on Corprew, and then going the other way to Virginia Beach Boulevard, there were, at the corner, there were 2 houses. One was owned by a black gentleman. I think his name was Mr. Wright, and I believe he taught at the high school, carpentry or something like that. And then right across the street from him was Mr. Diggs, Lawyer Diggs's house. He had the prettiest house in the neighborhood. Not only did he have his house, there were only 2 houses in that block where he was. His house, and then he had all the land west of his house to the corner where he had his own private tennis court, because blacks were not allowed to play on public tennis courts or private ones unless it was their own. And I know my father liked to go up there and play tennis. He and the Diggses were very friendly, my family was. And next to him was another black-owned piece of property by J.C. Brooks. He was a black real estate developer. And then across the next block was Reverend Handy. He was the pastor of one of the larger black churches. And then going down Handy's block, there was maybe 1 house in the whole block, or 2 houses. There was a black dentist and another black minister. So there weren't a lot of, all these in between were vacant lots. Some people had little gardens and that sort of stuff. And so blacks were just starting to move into the area. On the south was Corprew Avenue. On the other side of Corprew was a 9-hole public golf course for whites. You couldn't, if you were black, you couldn't even go on the course and caddy, so you couldn't play. And that remained that way until, I would say in the mid-50s, when the protest forced the city to start, they gave blacks, I think, 2 days a week to play on this course. And ultimately, that course, the city transferred the property to the state because that site was made available to establish, or not establish, but to move what is now Norfolk State University. Then it was a division of Virginia Union University, and it became a division of Virginia State, but its location was in downtown Norfolk, and they kept expanding, especially after the war. All the returning veterans, it just grew so fast that the old site, which was the old St. Vincent de Paul Hospital on Church Street, that was one of the sites, just, there were so many people, so many students that they just outgrew that site very rapidly. And that's when the decision was made to give them this land, which was the city-owned golf course. Of course, the city had more than one. They had three. This was one of them. And for Norfolk State University, then Norfolk State College.
Were there any African Americans who were involved in forcing the city to open up that golf course to blacks, and eventually involved in forcing the sale to the state?
Well, I'm sure there were, because I can remember Lawyer Diggs. I can remember P.B. Young Sr. from the Journal and Guide, the publisher of the Journal and Guide, and his son, P.B. Young. Well, he had two sons, P.B. Young Jr. and Tom Young, and Tom was active in the community, although he worked at the newspaper, and he was a lawyer, but he didn't practice very much. They were all active, and I'm sure that there were others. For instance, there were some blacks who liked to play golf. One of them would have been Mr. Riddick, Walter Riddick. Another would have been, oh dear, I can't think of his name at the moment, but it'll come to me. But they had a Black Golfers Association here, and they, of course, were very incensed by the fact that they were denied here as a publicly owned facility, and that they were denied. Dr. Samuel Coppage was very active on behalf of the NAACP, and he was very active in this struggle, and there were many others who were ordinary citizens, but either because of their occupation or their love for golf or their interest in doing something about these terrible discrimination laws that were part of this whole struggle. And I was just trying to, Charlie Fox, for instance, who is still alive, very avid golfer, I'm sure he and his group were part of that effort. I don't recall any specific litigation involving the golf course, but there was litigation involving Dr. Watts in Portsmouth, Dr. oh dear, he's now the current mayor of Portsmouth, Dr. Jim Hawley, another dentist who just, well, he didn't just, but who is retired now. He lived, I think he actually lives in Chesapeake, although his office was in Portsmouth. And they and some others were plaintiffs in a suit against the Commonwealth of Virginia to open Seashore State Park along on Shore Drive. They also were litigants. There was a city-owned golf course in Portsmouth. I don't recall the name now, but they were instrumental and were part of the plaintiffs in that suit, because these were all public facilities, and they were represented by Victor Ash and by James Overton, who was a black lawyer in Portsmouth. And of course, Hill, Martin, and Robinson were co-counsel, but these were local counsel here.
So tell me, was there any kind of organized effort on the part of black attorneys to push these kinds of cases, or were they haphazard in their approach?
Well, I wouldn't say either one of those choices. What we had was a state organization which was organized, the NAACP State Conference it was called, and it was made up of branches from the various cities and counties around the state. That was supplemented by a legal department, and the legal department was headed by Oliver Hill, Spotswood W. Robinson, Martin A. Martin. They were the law firm of Hill, Martin, and Robinson in Richmond. And they had what is known as local associate attorneys. In our area, Victor Ashe, here in Norfolk, J. Hugo Madison, here in Norfolk, in Portsmouth, James Overton, to mention at least three who were very prominent in this type of thing. Over in Hampton, for instance, in Newport News, there was Philip Walker. And there was, oh dear, this man is now deceased, but an older attorney, that is older than Phil, whose name at the moment eludes me. And there were some 2 or 3 other attorneys over in Hampton, Newport News that were what were described as local cooperating attorneys. Same thing out in Martinsville or Danville. There was Jerry Williams. There was a young lady attorney out there, geez, I can't think of her name either, I'm getting old, I can't remember all these names, who was a cooperating attorney. And then you go to Roanoke or Lynchburg or up in Northern Virginia and other areas where there were black attorneys. They would have one or more what we call cooperating attorneys in the area who would work with the state legal resources group headed by Oliver Hill and Spots Robinson and Martin A. Martin. And so if they had a case in your area, they would be like the lead attorneys, but you would have the local cooperating attorney who would be working with you, and especially if it was something that involved a jury and somebody who knew the local rules and that sort of thing. And this was true. They started out in this, well, they didn't start out in the recreation area. The first case that I recall hearing about was the case filed in Norfolk on what was then known as teacher equalization suit case. And that was, I don't think Victor Ashe had returned from, in fact, he may not have graduated from law school at that point, because it was about 39 or 40 that it was filed. The city and the school board, through their attorneys, dillied and dallied and strung things out so that by the time they would get to the point where they might be having some substantial hearings in a trial, the plaintiff's contract had expired. So, of course, they moved to have the case dismissed because they claimed that the plaintiff no longer had what we call standing to sue. She was no longer an employee of the school board. And the judge granted their motion and the case was dismissed, but they found a new plaintiff who was then under contract and filed another suit. And that suit, they wouldn't let them dilly and dally, and they were able to take that suit to trial and to a verdict. And the verdict was that they could no longer discriminate against black teachers or principals or other school personnel on the basis of race when they were paying white staff people who had the same qualifications, one salary, and paying blacks 30 or 40 or 50% less. So, but the problem was, even after you won that case, every jurisdiction where this issue was raised, none of them would yield. You have to litigate against every school board, whether it was county or city. None of them would yield to this precedent, even though they knew they were going to lose, because the law was very clear, because of course these people tried to appeal without success. And so you had to litigate this in city after city after county. And it was very frustrating and very, what is the word I want? Damaging to your legal talent. It's because they had to spend all this time on this when there were other things that they could have been utilizing their time and skill on.
So in essence, blacks had their own money used against them to continue to discriminate.
Oh, definitely. And for instance, the legislature would not, that would have been another approach. The legislature, since it was appropriating the basic funds for all the local schools, could have very easily included in their legislation a provision that said that thou, to the school boards, the local school boards, thou shalt not discriminate on account of race. And that would have aided the cause immeasurably. But of course, nothing like that was done.
Let me take us back to your birth and growing up and so forth by first asking you a little bit more about your mother's background. You said that she grew up in New York State. And what kind of family did she come from?
Well, her father was a minister, I believe a Presbyterian minister. And her mother was a homemaker, but she had been trained as a teacher, her mother had. And she had one sister and 5 brothers. And I think the 3 oldest brothers had served in the military during World War I. And one of the brothers, and I don't know if he was the oldest or not, Oscar, had gone on and graduated from Harvard College. My mother had gone on to the University of Chicago. Some of her other brothers and sisters had not gone on to college, but they'd finished high school and were working in various occupations. They grew up in this little town of Auburn, New York, which at that time had a population of maybe 25,000. There weren't a whole lot of blacks in Auburn, and there weren't many black churches, maybe 3 or 4 at that time. There were a lot of Irish, a lot of people from mid-European areas like Poland and so forth, and a lot of them, well, blacks had, especially the kids, had to deal with the fact that they were in a distinct minority. And apparently, my grandparents taught their kids that they were not to take any discrimination from their fellow students or their teachers, and to let them know if there was problems, and not be afraid to fight if attacked. They didn't go looking for fights, but they weren't going to run either. And so that was part of what they had to establish with the other youngsters, that they would compete, they would work, they'd be their friends, but they were not going to be attacked without consequences. And that was the way they were brought up.
And so when your mother finished school, what happened after she finished Columbia?
Well, University of Chicago, she went to New York City to seek employment. And one of her older brothers, and I guess maybe a couple of them, were all living in the New York City area and doing various things. My Elmer Carter was the one who went to Harvard College and graduated, and he was employed initially by the Urban League, and they put out a monthly magazine called Opportunity Magazine, and he was one of their early editors of Opportunity. and he wrote for and edited our Opportunity for several years. But in any event, my mother came to New York for employment, and she got employed with the YWCA in Brooklyn. In those times, they had a YMCA that basically served blacks, just like they had a YMCA in Harlem that basically served black males. And that's where she became first employed.
And then what happened after that?
Well, she worked there for until she got married. When she got married, she got married up there in that area in New York, and came down to Norfolk, which was my father's home, and was a housewife here. And of course, I was born, and she was active in the community. But you know, a new mother, there wasn't about so much activity that she could engage in, but she began. And of course, as I grew older, she was able to be more active. And in fact, there's a niece of J. Eugene Diggs who used to live at his house, and she would come down and babysit me at my house. And she is a retired teacher now who lives out in Ellen-J. Gardens. And all of a sudden, I can't think of her name.
Celestine
Diggs
Porter.
Right, Celestine Diggs Porter. She was one of my early babysitters, and she did a lot of things, especially in the field of education. And then she married a gentleman by the name of Porter, who was a teacher, I think, at the high school at Booker T, an athletic coach there, very able. In any event, when I got to be about 4 or 5, my parents decided that they didn't want me to go to these segregated schools in Norfolk. So my mother took me to New York. My parents, that is my father's parents, had this brownstone that my father had bought for them in New York, and that's where we lived, in this brownstone in Harlem. And there were other relatives in the house, cousins, you know, and because I don't know if you're familiar with brownstones, but they're 3 or 4 stories. And so a lot of people lived there. They were all family related in one way, cousins and so forth. And that's where we lived. My mother got a job working for the city of New York as a social worker in the Department of Welfare. And she went in at an entry level, and I don't recall what the position was called. She may have been an investigator or whatever the initial entry level position was. And it was civil service, and she took exams and began to rise up in the organization. And eventually she became the director of one of these branch offices, and which might have served a specific geographical area. And she went back to school, did graduate work at Fordham, and eventually kept taking these exams and moving up, and by about 1940, she had passed the exam and been appointed one of the 3 deputy directors for the whole New York welfare system. And that was pretty rapid moving up, because she didn't get there till about 31. And in those 9 years, she had moved up from an entry-level position to a deputy director. And that was pretty good.
So your parents then were definitely living apart from each other.
Oh, yes.
For how many years?
Well, from the time she left, which would have been about 31, until the time she came back, which would have been about 44. What happened was, of course, my father would come and visit, especially for holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas. My mother would come back to Norfolk, especially in the summer when her vacation was available. I would come back and live in Norfolk during the summer. And so that was how we kept in touch. And my mother was very active in various organizations in New York, one of which was the National Council of Negro Women. And she had risen up in the ranks through that organization, especially on the New York level, and was very active. And the headquarters was in D.C. And in 1943, around about July, she had been to Washington for a meeting. I don't know, it was the National Executive Board or something like that. And she was returning to New York on a train, which they called, can't remember the name now. Anyway, that train had this accident as it was passing through the city of Philadelphia. And several cars were derailed and a couple of hundred people were injured and some were killed. And my mother was one of those who was injured in this automobile, this train wreck. And of course she was in the hospital for about 3 weeks up there in Philadelphia. And we went up, my father and I, to Philadelphia, and my father was then very active with Norfolk Community Hospital. And he took the hospital ambulance, picked my mother up and brought her back to Norfolk. And he was the administrator at that time, the acting administrator of Norfolk Community Hospital. And that was how she got back here. And then she was on sick leave for several months, and then she eventually returned to work, but she continued to have trouble with her back. And sometime in '44, she retired or resigned because of this continuing trouble with her back, and came back to Norfolk full-time. And that's what happened. And that was about '44.
So now your parents, how were they keeping in touch with each other? Were they writing letters? Were they making telephone calls?
Oh, well, they were doing all that, and they were visiting back and forth. As I say, my father came up to New York. Meanwhile, we had moved out of my grandparents' home, and we had an apartment in Manhattan, about 10 or 15 blocks away. In fact, we moved a couple of times. And then in about 40 or 41, we bought a house. My parents did in Mount Vernon, New York, which is a suburb of New York City, and it's just outside of the Bronx. And in fact, if you not familiar where the line is, you won't know you're in another city. It's that close together. And so we moved, my mother and I moved up to Mount Vernon. My father would come up, and I went to school in high school in Mount Vernon.
So this actually provided you with a unique perspective. Up there in New York, going to school, interacting with a lot of people, coming down here to a very segregated environment. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what you remember growing up?
Well, I was very fortunate. There were young people near my age, some a little older, some a little younger, some my age, in our neighborhood out on Boulevard Terrace. Over, just one block over, was the Reverend Hamilton and his family. He had about 5 or 6 kids, and some of them were around my age. Across the street was Dr. A.J. Wells. He was a dentist. He had 3 kids. The 2 girls were older, but the son, he and I were about my age. And then just 3 or 4 blocks down on Virginia Beach Boulevard, at that portion that was west of Park Avenue, it was called Calvert Street. And it wasn't Virginia Beach Boulevard. The traffic went right in there. And Dr. G.W.C. Brown and his wife and family lived up there, and their son and I were about the same age. He had 2 daughters, they were both older. But anyway, there were a number of young people that I associated with when I came down here for the summer. And there were some that were a little young. Right around the corner on Corporal, there was Dr. Givens, who was a black surgeon here, and he had 2 kids, but his daughter was 16 years older than I was, but his son was about 3 or 4 years younger. So it was another kid in the neighborhood that we would play with and associate with. But it was interesting, in the areas that I lived in Manhattan, for instance, there, and the schools I went to, the schools were all integrated. There were, some of the neighborhoods were semi-integrated. For instance, there might be 1 or 2 or 3 white families right around the corner, that type of thing. And then much of the time it was apartment houses, especially as I left my grandparents. We moved from one apartment house to another, and apartment houses had a lot of apartments. There weren't a lot of single-family houses in that neighborhood. And so there were a lot of people around. And it was interesting. My playmates were both black and white in New York. When I came home to Norfolk, they were all black because there were no white families with children living anywhere near close to where we were. My father was an active member of Grace Episcopal Church here. He would always take me to church with him on Sunday, even when I was just a little child. And there were no whites who were members, as far as I knew, of any of the black churches. And there were several of them around here, and they're still here. So your exposure was a lot different. And of course, you had segregation on the public transportation, the buses, but as a youngster, I didn't do much bus riding. If I went anywhere, my parents would take me and bring me back. So I didn't get exposed as much. But when you were traveling, say, between here and New York, or coming the other way from New York to Norfolk, especially on the train, that was how we traveled mostly then, there was a point where you would have to transfer. And I can't remember whether it was up in Delaware or where it was, but if you were going north, that's where you left a segregated passenger train and got into a train that was integrated, and vice versa if you were coming south. So it was there. You were exposed, but it was not a big part of it. Nobody, they didn't let you forget you were black, if that's what you're asking.
Once your mother returned to Norfolk in 1944, what were some of the things that she did? I understand she's...
Well, number one, there was no interracial organization here, and which my mother thought was very unfortunate. She was used to working in New York in biracial or interracial organizations, and she recognized that there were a lot of problems in this area. And so she thought that it would be useful and helpful if an interracial women's organization were created, because she felt women could do a lot of things that might be difficult to do with an interracial men's organization. So she started calling around first among black women, and then widened her scope, and she identified some white women, and through them other women were identified, and they were invited to come to a meeting to discuss this possibility. And as a result, an organization was started called the Women's Interracial Council. Now, my mother had some experience starting organizations up in New York, so she knew a little bit about it. And she articulated and identified some of the needs that this organization might tackle. And one of the early efforts of the organization related to public housing. Just before, in 1939, Norfolk City had organized something called the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority. That was a state, an agency authorized by the state of Virginia to deal with the atrocious and very poor public housing in the Norfolk area. But before they could get going very well, along came World War II in December of 1941. Well, by that time they had already designed a couple of proposed projects. One of them was called Liberty Park, which was to be frame housing, because some of the worst housing in the city was in what was really the downtown area. But before you could attack those houses, you had to put up other housing where people in those areas were living, where they could move to, because housing was highly segregated. And so Liberty Park was somebody's farm. There was no housing out there. It was just a farm. So it was a good place to put some initial housing. Another place was what was to become Roberts Park, which was off of Princess Anne Road. North of Princess Anne Road, roughly between South Street and on the west, and Norchester, or somewhere around there on the east. But in any event, it was also vacant land, and they started constructing houses in both of these sites. And before they could get them finished, World War II began, when the United States was attacked in December of 1941. And so instead of moving people out of the downtown areas where they had poor housing, they had to put, in both of these projects, people who were coming into Norfolk by the hundreds and thousands to work for the government, like the Navy, or to work for private companies who were engaged in defense work. And these people had to have a place to live, because the housing was not available. So that's how those first two areas now, there were probably about 300 units in Roberts Park, and there were something like 900 units in Liberty Park. And my father was engaged as the first manager. He was hired by the Redevelopment and Housing Authority to manage both of these projects. Of course, he was in the real estate business, and he had also managed privately owned property for occupancy by tenants, so he had some experience and knowledge in this area. And so that's how he got into those two projects. And those areas, as I say, were occupied by persons who were working for the military and defense industries. And when my mother came back, she started the Women's Interracial Council. One of their first projects was to do an on-site survey of one of the proposed redevelopment areas. Right now, that area has a large public housing project called Young Park, named after Mr. P.B. Young Sr. But then it was mostly frame buildings, some apartments, some single-family houses. Many of the houses did not have indoor water, that is plumbing, indoor plumbing or indoor city water. They would have a pump outside in the yard. Members of the Women's Interracial Council, equipped with clipboards and questionnaires and so forth, volunteered to, on behalf of the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority, to go out and do surveys in this area, which they did. For many of the women, white and black, they weren't even aware that there were houses in the city of Norfolk that did not have indoor plumbing or did not have indoor water. They had pumps and they had outhouses in the backyard. Most of these houses were frame. Most of them were quite old. There were a few brick residences, not many. I know one of the black doctors had a brick residence there that he used as an office, and it was Dr. Webb. And it was very revealing to the members of this organization to see a side of their own city that they were unaware of. And then when they made their report to the Redevelopment and Housing Authority, and this was very helpful in the building public support for the proposed efforts of the Housing Authority to acquire all of this land, not only where Young Park is currently located, but which would be north of Brambleton Avenue and going all the way to Princess Anne Road on the north, and then coming east as far as Church Street, and then going west as far as Monticello Avenue. I don't know how many acres we're talking about, but it was quite a bit of land. The next project that the city wanted to redevelop and the Housing Authority wanted to was south of Brambleton. And part of it was residential. There was a Catholic school there for blacks, and elementary. I don't know if they went up to high school or not. I'm not sure of that. But it was called, I think, St. Joseph's, if I recall. And
They did have a high school.
okay, they had a high school. I was not certain of that. In any event, they were there, and there were black churches, black businesses. There were black dentists had an office there, and there were other businesses. And the city wanted to acquire that land, to tear everything down, and make it available partially for commercial use and partially for some residential use, but basically commercial use. For instance, the area west of what is now St. Paul's Boulevard and going over to Monticello. Now, between Brambleton and Freemason, this is where Scope is now located, and Chrysler Hall. Now, where Chrysler Hall is, there was a large black church that had been there for many, many, many years. And
Bank Street Baptist.
yeah, that's right, Bank Street. I couldn't remember. In any event, they elected to sell their land and acquire other land in the northern part of the city, up in the Norview area, which proved to be a wise choice. And that's just one of the churches. There were other buildings of that kind that were forced to relocate because the housing authority was acquiring the land. Then there was the whole area where they, south of Bramilton and going all the way down to the area where St. Mary's Church is located, and they were trying to acquire that land, part of it for housing, when another part for a downtown shopping center, which was ultimately come about. But the impetus to get this all started was the survey, I believe. It was an important part of the survey of the area around Young Park and adjacent areas that were done by this Women's Interracial Council.
Why do you think your mother thought that women in an interracial organization could accomplish more than men in the
Well, two or three reasons. Number one, she felt that first you had to convince whites who were control the city and who were in the majority that certain ideas and certain projects were desirable, especially if those ideas and those projects went against their pre-adopted notions of a segregated society. This was very important. And if you wanted to go forward with these concepts and even go further than that, you had to convince some of the people in the majority. And she thought, and others, that women were much more apt to be fairer. Women were the mothers of children. Women recognized the needs of children and family and were much more understanding and sympathetic to those needs. And that would be the first step. Most of these women, maybe not all of them, but most of them were married. Their spouses were in influential positions in the city. Some were in the public sector, others, most were in the private sector. For instance, some of the wives of some of these white women were, their husbands were active in the Landmark Communications, which operated the daily newspaper. So you wanted to get a favorable reaction and response from the newspaper and from their editorial approach. Because at that time we had two daily newspapers. The morning paper, which was the Virginian Pilot, and the afternoon paper, which was the Ledger Star. And between those two papers, one was, as is often the case in a city where you have two publications, one was, quote, the so-called conservative paper, and the one was the liberal paper. And you needed that kind of support. And other members, the spouses of other of these women, they were in businesses, they were in the banks, they were in the department stores, that is, their husbands. And they affected and influenced the commercial life of the community. So the effect that the women would have was considerably more than just their views, because they would influence their family, their husbands. And that was very important. And that was part of what was behind why she wanted to organize these women.
The Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority has been described euphemistically as the Negro Removal Authority. And I was wondering if then the Women's Council, if they were aware of that, if they tried to address or allay fears.
Well, yes, but each city situation is an individual situation. They recognized, for instance, that there were just a very small number of blacks who were registered voters. And it was important that more people become registered voters. The city was not all that large at that time. The city was also in an expansive mode. They were trying to annex portions of the adjoining county, which was Norfolk County, especially going east towards Virginia Beach. And in order to get more undeveloped land within the city boundaries, because the major source of the city's income in Virginia was real estate taxes. And so if you were confined in the amount of land that you had, you've already shortened or diminished or reduced your potential income. So that was one of the reasons that was leading Norfolk to try to annex adjoining land. And of course, you've got all these Virginia statutes to deal with, and one of which is one city cannot annex land from an adjoining city unless the other city consents. But a city can annex land from an adjoining county, even though they may object. And they have a whole statutory scheme to effectuate this. So they were following this scheme, and it wasn't until about 1950, and they'd been litigating 6 or 7 years or longer, that they were successful in annexing this land from Norfolk County. And it went out to the east, I guess, to about where Military Highway is, between Ballantyne Road on the east, and then going east to Military Highway. That was all part of old Norfolk County. And then it went all the way to the Chesapeake Bay, and on the north. And then the south, of course, it went around the city of South Norfolk and all around to Portsmouth. But we weren't involved in that, as the city was only trying to annex that portion that was immediately to the east of Norfolk. And they finally were successful. And that got a lot of undeveloped land that made available and brought it into the city. So all of these were factors. There was a demand for housing, but there wasn't a whole lot of undeveloped land in Norfolk. And for instance, there was an area right off of Virginia Beach Boulevard between Broad Creek and Ballantyne, and it was called the people who purchased it called it Broad Creek Shores. The land had been owned by the United States government. When they were acquiring land in this area, north of Virginia Beach Boulevard, they acquired this huge piece of land between Virginia Beach Boulevard and Princess Anne Road, and they put up 3,000 units, supposedly of temporary housing, for whites. They put up 900 units for blacks in Liberty Park for blacks. This was supposed to have been public housing, but what happened, of course, the war came along, and they housed war workers and that type of stuff in these two developments. After the war, when a lot of the employment decreased, the federal government and housing for whites became more available. That particular housing development, the 3,000 unit development, was closed down, and all of the structures were demolished. The city of Norfolk acquired the land from the federal government, and it was to be used to build a commercial park that is for businesses. Many of the businesses in downtown Norfolk that were going to be acquired, the sites were being acquired under the redevelopment program, had to have places to move, and that was where one of the places a lot of them moved to. And it was ideal for that industrial park. The streets were there, water and sewerage was there. They had railroad tracks. They had two major highways on the north and on the south. And so it was ideal for that purpose. And so the city was very pleased to have that opportunity to acquire that site. But on the other side of the street was this land that they'd also acquired, but they'd never used. So under, I can't remember whether it was Eisenhower, but whoever was president after Truman, the feds began selling off this excess land. Some of it they had used, some of it they had never used. And this was one of the pieces. But before they sold any piece, they gave the local area, the state, or the locality, the city or county, for a shot at the land. Well, at that time, that land was in Norfolk County. Norfolk County wanted some land, maybe 30 acres to put up a school, but they didn't want 90 acres, which was what this parcel was, so they declined. And it was in Norfolk County, so the city of Norfolk didn't have a shot at it. So that resulted in them putting the land up for public auction. They advertised in the paper, and anybody could bid on it. And some blacks, Dr. Watts, Irving Watts, who was a dentist in Portsmouth, and my father bid on that land because they were trying to find sites for housing for blacks, which was in very short supply. And they were the successful bidders. And they got this land, and they subdivided a portion of it, put a street in, and that sort of thing. And then they had a lot of trouble because the land was located within a mile of the city of Norfolk, of an adjoining city, and there was a statute in the state code that said that you had to also submit any plans to the local city planning agency. And of course, they didn't want any blacks out there, because right next to that was a whole area called Ingleside, which was occupied by whites, even a public elementary school out there. Anyway, finally the plan got approved, and they started selling lots out there. And by this time, the annexation of this land in old Norfolk County in Tannis Creek had gone through. It became effective. They had appealed it up to the Supreme Court and so forth. January 1st, 1955, that's when it became part of the city of Norfolk. And they had just got the plans approved and began selling lots. And these were lovely lots. And there was a little water on one side. And here it was in the city of Norfolk now. And the next thing you know, the city wants to acquire this land. And why do they want to acquire it? Because they need more land for recreation, for a public park in the city of Norfolk. Of course, that was their spoken reason. Nobody believed that. None of the white people who were saying this, none of the black people, and certainly not the owners. They knew perfectly well the reason that the city wanted to acquire this land was to prevent blacks from moving into that neighborhood. Because they had right across the street 20 times the amount of that land in the project that the feds had, but which the feds conveyed, where there had been this huge public housing project. And even though they were going to put commercial buildings and had started, there was plenty of land for recreation use. Plus, just 2 years earlier, the city had commissioned an outside agency to review all of their recreational needs and to advise the council and the city on what needs they might have for the next 25 years and so forth. This land was not even remotely considered as being a possible city recreation site, and because there were a lot of other available sites. So their ostensible reason was purest lies. And but unfortunately, at that time, the state of the law was, if you wanted to contest a condemnation action, would you, as the property owner who were contesting it, would you be able to demonstrate that the ostensible reason that they had given, the public reason they had given for wanting to get this land was just a fake, not really the true reason? Could you get behind their public statements? And the Supreme Court had not decided. Subsequently, they did decide a case out in Indiana, I think Gary, where they allowed the plaintiffs the opportunity to puncture that artificial balloon and go beyond their alleged reasons and show that it was really racial prejudice that was motivating them, that was the true reason. But that case hadn't been decided at this point. So what the owners did was, of course, they refused to sell. That was the first thing. When a majority of the city council voted to authorize the city attorney to go ahead with a condemnation action, the owners, with the help of some of the people that had bought the lots and some others, particularly P.B. Young and Tom Young, and Maurice Collette, who had bought some of the land to sell to others and to put his own house, we organized, and others organized, an effort to have a referendum election on this council action that they had adopted, authorizing that the city condemn this land or acquire this land through the condemnation process. And in 3 days, we got over 2,500 signatures, which would have put this question on the ballot as a referendum. And just before the deadline is 5 o'clock on Friday, at 3 o'clock on Friday, these petitions with the signatures were presented to the city clerk. So it was timely, but very close. Nobody believed that this effort would be successful. Number one, in the previous 8 or 10 years, there had been 3 or 4 efforts at having these elections which were designed to challenge some action taken by city council. And each one of these efforts were well funded, and it had taken them 3 or 4 months to get the requisite number of signatures. We had gotten the right, or the more than enough, because some people, they lie, they don't tell you that they're not really registered voters. They won't admit to that, or they don't live in your city. So we got more signatures. We only needed about 1,800 and got about 2,500, because you know some of these people are going to be lying to you. Any event, but nobody had been in the past had ever challenged the referendum and got the signatures in 3 days. It just had never been done. We had a lot of support. The newspaper, the daily newspaper, was very supportive. Everybody knew what was going on. It was no secret. And what they did was, the council vote was 4-3. So what they were able to do is persuade one councilman from the majority to switch with the 3 in the minority, so you got another 4-3 vote on a deal, a compromise deal, whereby the owners would sell a portion of the land, but would not sell to the city the portion that had been subdivided into lots and where some of the lots had already been sold to potential homeowners. And that was the deal. Hindsight, wonderful 20/20 vision. You got half a loaf. We would have loved to have kept it all, because what happened was, no sooner than they got the site, then they sold 30 acres to the school board, Norfolk County School Board, because that's all they wanted. And they didn't want 90 acres, they just wanted 30, because they never built a school there, but that's a different story. And that land inured to the benefit of the Norfolk public schools, but they never built a school there either. What the city did was, with the land that they agreed to sell them, which was roughly about 35 or 40 acres, instead of putting up a school, what they did was they made another commercial park out of it. Well, the first thing they did was they moved the armory. The city had an armory in a different section of the city that was in need of being relocated. So the portion of the land closest to the home sites, they moved the armory over there and built this new armory for the National Guard. And then the remaining land they developed for commercial office space. And so, of course, their original expressed reason for wanting to get this land, to enlarge the land available for recreational use, was exposed as a total fraud, a total lie, and made you think about some of the actions that subsequent administrations have done when they wanted to achieve a particular purpose, like now in this whole Iraq war business. They're just a tissue of lies as to the reason for going there. But that was a deal that we had to cut. We were trying to at least protect the people who had bought lots out there. I say we, I'm talking about